So good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Ernesto Mendez. I co-direct the Institute for Agroecology with Colin Anderson, the IFA. And we wanted to welcome you to our PowerUp series. So this is a public-facing event series where we are inviting the UVM and the broader community to engage with the work of the IFA and the work of our partners and our collaborators. And we are holding them how often? Once a semester?
Twice a semester.
Twice a semester. So yeah, so make sure you keep an eye on them. We try to put them out a lot, at least at UVM, but we're really happy to be able to welcome our dear colleague and friend, Professor Rachel Bezner Kerr. And I am going to let our IFA postdoc, Emily Hoyler, introduce her because Emily has worked with Rachel for a long time before she came here. So to you, Emily. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, so it's my honor to introduce Dr. Rachel Bezner Kerr today. Thanks so much to everybody who's joining in person and to everyone who's joining online. Dr. Bezner Kerr is a professor in global development, the director of the Graduate Field of Development Studies, and the director of the Institute for African Development at Cornell University. She does long-term research in Malawi and Tanzania using participatory research methods to test the impacts of agroecological approaches on livelihoods, nutrition, and sustainable land management for rural communities. She co-authored a UN high-level panel of experts 2019 report on agroecology. She was a coordinating lead author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC AR6 report, Climate Change 2022, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. And she will be a lead author for the upcoming IPCC AR7 report. Along with being a global leader and advocate for agroecology and participatory research, Rachel is a wonderful mentor, collaborator, and colleague. We've actually just finished up a workshop with her Critical Agroecologies Lab and the IFA Lab, workshopping papers that people are working on. And it's a great opportunity for cross-pollination between the spaces. And it's something that Rachel has really advocated for with her students and colleagues, and is really grateful for her dedication on that front, and looking forward to strengthening the long-term collaboration and network that we have. Dr. Bezner Kerr's talk today is entitled Agroecological Transformations, Challenges. So,
thanks very much for that warm welcome and that introduction. And I'm really delighted to be here today. It's been a couple of years since I've been in Vermont, and I'm really glad to be back. And I was excited about the idea of talking about agroecological transformations. Although once I started to think about it, I got very nervous because, let me see if this works. Click, yes. So, this is the HLPE 13 Principles of Agroecology. We drew this from the literature. And on the side, you have Steve Gleasman's kind of transformation scale. At the bottom, you have kind of the plot and farm scale. And then as you move up, you are transforming at the kind of territorial scale. And then ideally, the whole food system, kaboom, gets changed. And as Emily mentioned, I've been doing this long-term research in Malawi. So I thought, yeah, I can talk about this. But then I started getting really intimidated, like, wait a minute, I don't think we can talk about Malawi being transformed. So in terms of an agroecological system writ large, so it's easier said than done. You have this lovely, set of principles and you mush them all together and kaboom, you get transformation. Well, there's been some writing about transformation. We have this diagram. I borrowed this from Colin and his author's paper from 2019, which was drawn from Giels and Schott, looking at, okay, how does transformation happen? You have these niches and they work on these, innovations, and then they have maybe connections, and then transformation happens. Sounds good, but again, challenging. So Colin in this paper with his co-authors, they put together these kind of domains of transformation. Okay, in agroecology, these are some important domains to think about. So I thought, okay, I'm going to work with this. So bear with me. This is a kind of work in progress. I was kind of taking my work and then connecting it to agroecological transformations. I haven't published about agroecological transformations as a concept, but I'm going to talk about these domains as they relate to the work in Malawi. Initially, I was also going to talk about other parts of the world. I've done some research in Senegal. I do a little bit of research in the States, but I got completely, I thought, no, I can't do that because I don't have the depth of knowledge. So I cut a bunch of slides and we're just sticking with Malawi. So welcome to Malawi. It is a small country in southern Eastern Africa. It is primarily reliant on agriculture. Most people rely on agriculture for food and farming and livelihoods. The majority of people are smallholder farmers, very small farms. About less than a hectare on average, one rainy season. Low soil fertility is a challenge for many people. And many families struggle with chronic food insecurity and high levels of child malnutrition. Women are very actively involved in farming and social reproduction, but there is relatively high gender inequality in terms of decision making and in terms of division of labor and other aspects of gender relations. And 50% or more of rural population live in poverty, less than $2 a day. The average income is around $500 per capita per year. So challenging context in which to imagine an agroecological transformation. There's also been a very strong emphasis in this country on the industrial model with the promotion of synthetic fertilizer and hybrid seed through subsidies and through discourse for decades, with some rollback at times and then return to the subsidy program. So I have been doing research in Malawi for next year. It'll be 30 years. So a long time, mostly in the north, which is in the dark gray area, in Mzimba district and somewhat in Rumpi district, but also in the central region in Dedza district. I've also worked a little bit in Karonga, but with a team, I've been doing long-term collaborative research, participatory research with smallholder farmers and with a nonprofit organization and a hospital and agricultural scientists, nutritionists, ecologists, other social scientists, both Malawian and international. So when I use the word we, it is a we, and it's varied over the years. Malawi, in addition to the kind of picture I drew for the specific context of farm families, faces many other challenges to imagine an agroecological transition. These include very high debt load. This is a country that has very little leeway to embark on its own transformation. It relies on international funding, and those donors often have their own agendas. And they are often very focused on intensification of largely staples. You have strong climate change impacts in the country. You've had severe drought. You've had severe flooding in the last few years. And you also have this photograph I took a year ago. This is a familiar icon to some. It's one of the big retail giants in the food industry now in Malawi. So you have increasing in a disparity in terms of the food system with the kind of elite and middle class purchasing from grocery stores, supermarket chains, and fast food outlets such as this one, while the rural population is still buying from largely the informal food system. And the food prices, along with the cost of living, has skyrocketed in Malawi with, I think last year, deflation was 40% devaluation of the currency. And so that can make local reliance, trying to make a living as a farmer, trying to sell your food products, very challenging. So challenges, enormous in this context. That photograph is gone. Anyways, that was people. Sorry about that. I am drawing from several studies to share with you some of my ideas about agroecological transformation. And they're over several time periods, working with 6,000 farming households in North and Central region, working with 400 households in North and Central region, and working with 500 households in both in the North and Central region. So you can see we're consistent that way, North and Central, pre and post and control or delayed intervention prevention versus intervention. So a sort of quasi-experimental model where we introduce the principles of agroecology, and then farmers choose what they want to test. And oh, there's the photo. There we go. Okay. And so we have used a range of different research methods, just so you know where I'm drawing the data from: surveys, structured surveys, interviews, collection of agricultural data, nutritional data, ecological data, social data. And we also do participatory workshops where we check in with farming communities about their experiences and what challenges they're having. That's an important part of this kind of iterative design where we're adapting things over time. And I did a photo voice project in 2022 with 40 farmers who had long-term experience using agroecological methods. So some of what I'm presenting here comes from their perspectives, because I think that's important for thinking about agroecological transformation, not only in terms of, the big picture and government and so on, but what are farmers' experiences? What are their perspectives on agroecological transformation? And so farmers here in this region, in terms of practices, they're choosing to work with things like agroforestry, things like doubled up or legume intercrops, which they rotate with maize, use of compost, integrating animals more back into the farming system, and crop diversification. And in all of these sort of long-term research projects, we've had farmers meeting monthly to share their experiences, doing exchanges between different farmers. And so a lot of kind of farmer to farmer sharing and farmer to farmer and on-farm experimentation. But at the same time, we've also had this dimension of kind of attention to the social dimensions of agroecology. And that includes developing, based on what we've learned in terms of social inequalities operating within households and communities in Malawi, and how those can mitigate against improvements in food security and nutrition and livelihoods. We've developed a range of different sort of educational strategies, community-based educational strategies that include the use of theater, having recipe days, having small group discussions. And eventually we created a curriculum that integrated those activities around social issues and with hands-on activities related to agroecology and climate change and nutrition. And so what have we found in terms of what's the potential for agroecological transformation? Well, if you think about sort of the farm level, we've been able to demonstrate that farmers who are taking on these different practices and participating in these community-based educational activities are able to improve their food security and their nutrition significantly. And so this has been a consistent finding, and that includes women's dietary diversity, as well as we've looked at child dietary diversity and overall household dietary diversity. We've measured child growth. We've also found modest but significant improvements in income. Now, when you say, what does she mean by modest? We're talking less than $20 annual increase. So we're talking modest. So not anything to run to your funder and say, look at how much we're transforming livelihoods. Livelihoods are a tough nut to crack, and I'll come back to that later. What are farmers saying about these changes that they've wrought in their farms and in their communities? So one of the things that comes through in that photo voice work I did is this real pride at what they've achieved on their land in terms of improving soils and improving their food security status. So, this farmer is saying, I'm like clapping my hands. I'm so happy. The maize is doing well, and I have more diversity, the wild fruits. So these are photos they took to show their struggles and joys with agroecology. Others took photos of new ways of being, new ways of operating within households, particularly around gender. So this farmer took photographs, or had his family take photographs of him doing laundry and him carrying firewood. And he talked about how this was a core change that was happening. This was a transformation that was happening in his household, quite significant to him. And other farmers talked about sharing between each other, sharing seeds, sharing information, and doing experiments. Here they're trying out rice, not a common crop in this region, and they're experimenting with growing it. So a lot of excitement around changing their practices, but also sharing information and seeds as being an important component, and a changing way of thinking about their relationship with animals. So photographs of chickens and other animals were a common theme in the Photo Voice project that I did with them. They also had photographs about some of the headaches and frustrations and worries. A lot of those had to do with climate change impacts, so flooding, severe flooding, drought, pest and disease outbreak, and how it made them worried, like, how am I going to manage this? How am I going to deal with this problem? I'm feeling hopeless, I'm feeling overwhelmed. So not all the agroecological transformation that you would want, even at the farm level, because of these broader factors affecting their lives. Another interesting theme that was very exciting was transforming landscapes. So this farmer took a photograph of a forest that he had regenerated since 2012, and it was a space that he went to calm himself. He got fresh air, he heard the birds singing, and he wasn't the only person who is as part of the joys that he wanted to depict from agroecological transformation, this landscape level transformation, which was a real focus on forest spaces. So we found, and this is partly from work from one of my former PhD students, Sydney Madison, that there's multiple ways that people are transforming this pathway, this agroecological transformation in terms of household level. They are saving money on fertilizer, and that's a huge pathway to transforming their household situation. They're taking the saved money and they're investing it in dry season vegetable gardens, or they're investing it in livestock. They're no longer having to purchase expensive inputs. But another important feature is changes in gender relations also having an impact on the household economy and on the household food security. So one of the studies, we found that farmers who changed from not discussing farming with their spouse to discussing farming with their spouse were 2.4 times more likely to have improved their food security and dietary diversity. At the beginning of this study, we found only 10% of households reported discussing farming with their spouse. So very little knowledge sharing within the household around farming at the beginning. And so we, in some of our studies, we've looked at, okay, what are the factors that increase the likelihood of farmers using these practices? And these farmer-to-farmer networks were very important. Much more likely that farmers would implement practices and implement more practices if they were involved in these farmer networks and sharing information. And they were participating in these community-based educational activities that focus on one theme is a focus on addressing gender inequalities in the household and in communities. I forgot to check the time before I start, but I think I'm okay. So I won't talk about this at length, but we've done a sort of extensive 2 sets of research projects looking at the kind of landscape scale and what's happening at the landscape scale. And we found that, well, first of all, we went back to a place where we had done this intervention of agroecology training. And 2 years after the intervention was over, we found that 90% of households were still using the practices. They weren't necessarily talking about gender relations, but they were still using the agroecological practices. And we, in a separate study, we looked at the likelihood of sort of natural forest generation. And we found that we compared 2 villages, one which had this agroecology intervention several years before and one which did not. And we did this because we had found sort of qualitative evidence that farmers who were involved in the agroecology intervention started to talk differently about forests and biodiversity. And we found there was a significant difference in the amount of land dedicated to fallow and natural forest regeneration in those households that in those villages, in the village where the agroecology intervention had taken place. And we also found a significant difference in terms of their ideas and their value towards forests and biodiversity. And we've looked at the landscape level effects on wild biodiversity and found some significant impacts on biodiversity, wild biodiversity. Oh. So increase in butterfly species richness and wasp abundance, for example. But I'm not going into greater length here. This is kind of a whole other body of work, but really looking at agroecological transformation in terms of landscape level change and with a focus on biodiversity. And this is coming back to the kind of labor dynamics at work here. And this is drawing on the work of my former student, Sydney Madsen. And one of the important things that farmers reported doing is not having to rely as much on what's called ganyu in Malawi, which is this off-farm work on other people's farms. And because they were able to gain enough from their own farm, they didn't have to turn to off-farm work. And this led to this kind of virtuous cycle that got them into a better situation. So this is from her study where she looked at, the likelihood that the probability that they would participate in this off-farm work, which is quite exploitative work that you're doing on your wealthy neighbor's farm because you've run out of your own food. Essentially, you go to your neighbor and say, do you have any work? I have absolutely no food left in my household. Or I need some money to be able to, purchase fertilizer, that sort of thing. And so this farmer, for example, says, in the past, we would finish our food in August, then we would have to do ganyu while preparing the foods. We would take turns. Some days we do ganyu, other days doing land preparation. Now we're applying compost, and so we don't have to do that. And so this really increased their ability to invest time in their own farms through this kind of decommodifying of inputs to the farm. And that allowed them to invest in things like soil health and pest and disease management, and which in turn improved their food security longer term. So that meant that they could do things like in the past that they would just quickly run to the field. You can imagine you're done working on someone else's farm. It's almost dark. You're like, okay, let me just go check and just quickly check the crop and make sure it's doing okay. And that's literally what they describe. Now they have the time to actually do more monitoring and that kind of more knowledge intensive work that's required in agroecological production. So they talk about how they've seen changes in the land because they've had more time to devote to environmental management. And it's also built their skills and sort of re-skilled them in terms of these environmental management, farm management decisions. And it also motivated them. So in the past, farming became this incredibly stressful experience where you're working on someone else's farm. It's like, oh, I gotta go and check my farm. And you knew you were not investing the time that you needed to get a good result. And so it was incredibly stressful. Now they reported it made them happy because they saw that they were gonna get good results. And that made them go even more and they started to invest more time because they were seeing really positive results. So this person said, the crops make me happy. They make me go, even if you don't want to, you even go both in the forenoon and afternoon just to see if there's been any change. And so this is affecting sort of affective dimensions of their lives as well, this feeling of hopefulness and that they're seeing results that are improving their lives and their families' lives. And they talk, some of them, and this is a photograph from the Photo Voice project, about how they can see, even in the face of things like drought, that their land is able to produce something because the land has been improved, the soil has improved its ability to retain moisture, and they have greater diversity in their crops. And so even in the face of drought, they're able to manage. And we're currently undertaking a 3-year project kind of digging into this in more detail. What are the different practices that can really withstand dry spells, other climate change impacts? Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about some of our work around agroecological markets, because I mentioned that the modest livelihood impacts we've been doing. So it's been a strong request from farmers for many years to try to help them develop viable local or regional markets. And so for the last 3 years, we've been doing this project in collaboration with a couple of different organizations in the north, and working also with Alison Leconto, who's in France, who's had experience developing these agroecological markets in other places. We've held stakeholder meetings, these kind of visioning exercises in 4 different cities or towns, depending on the size, in northern Malawi, and tried to determine what consumers were interested in, what the municipality was willing to do in terms of places we could have these markets. And we established 4 agroecological markets last year, so this is very new. And they're selling produce, but they're also selling some value-added products such as flour and honey. And that should say farmer associations. There's a farmer association that's already been established for a number of years, and there's some youth groups, and they're trying to work together to get products to market. And we've done consumer surveys. We did them before we started the markets, and then we've done them each year during the kind of main selling period, and looked at their knowledge and awareness of agroecology as a kind of concept, and also what they're willing to pay. And we found they're willing to pay $1.38, between $1.38 and $1.75 for more for an agroecological food product. So again, a modest increase, but given the economic constraints in Malawi, that's actually a positive outcome. We would see that they're willing to pay more for these agroecological products. And there is concern about pesticide use, and there is interest in supporting local traditional products. And so here's our market sales from the last couple of years. The main things that are being sold are vegetables, peanut butter, peanut flour, and maize flour from a local open pollinated variety of maize. So still low volume, but we are also not perfect in terms of people reporting the sales. So we think it might be a little bit more, but a long way to go. I don't know if you saw, but it's between $5 and $10 of sales a month total for a market. So again, not huge dollar amounts. So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of agroecological transformations around markets. So this is a TBD, like watch this space or something. We're working on this, but many constraints. And I'm going to try to do the governance in 5 minutes, right? Because what time do we finish? Here's my timekeeper. At 4? Okay. So we've also been doing some research with some Malawian colleagues and my former student, Sydney, and a student intern from Switzerland, trying to look at the kind of perspectives from different actors in terms of government representatives, civil society representatives, and other actors in terms of agroecology, trying to understand what are the barriers and enablers to having support for agroecological transformations writ large in Malawi. And alongside that, we did policy analysis of 19 policies, and we used a framework that had been developed initially for looking at funding programs, and we applied it to Malawian policies. And we found that, and this certainly concurred with our own perspective from having worked in this space for a while, that one of the major barriers that people considered, including people working in government, is the input subsidy program, both in terms of the amount of money that it plows into intensified agriculture that could be used to support an agroecological transformation, but also in terms of the kind of focus on short-term productivity at the expense of a longer-term holistic approach to addressing food security in the country. And so many people saw this as both the discourse and the money being a major barrier to an agroecological transformation in Malawi. Alongside that, people talked about the way that agricultural extension is taught in Malawi as another major barrier. Again, both in terms of content, so a focus primarily on productivity, but also in terms of how it's taught. So very much sort of hierarchical teaching. I'm the expert, you're learning from me. And alongside that, a sort of denigration of indigenous knowledge and farmer knowledge in particular is being backwards, that they need to be taught to understand. And so it's both the content, the approach, and extension itself has been majorly cut back with structural adjustment and with the focus on input subsidies. So lack of funding, the way they're teaching, what they're teaching, all of those things were a barrier. Not as many people talked about this, but some of our respondents talked about the role of international funders and private sector actors in preventing agroecological approaches from being undertaken. So this included how different policies were developed, who was at the table, what role they played in influencing the content of policies, and what kinds of strategies were taken in terms of agricultural policy and agricultural education and agricultural research. This was another barrier identified. Now, in terms of the policies, we found that most policies did not have many agroecological principles, they were not rife with agroecological principles. They had less than 30%. If 100% would be, all the principles were being used and they were used many times or were evident in the way the policy was written. So it was less than 30%. With some, like the Pesticide Act, was 0. And the most promising policies were the Malawi Vision 2063, which is the kind of government-wide strategy, the National Agricultural Policy, and the National Resilience Strategy. And then in terms of the principles were really forefronted, it was biodiversity, social values and diets, and economic diversification with input reduction, recycling, and things like knowledge co-creation, much lower, much less common. What this looks like in practice, so this is our depiction of the Malawi Vision 2063. It met 26% of the possible score, and that included things like mentioning organic fertilizer, talking about water harvesting, talking about high value niche crops. So that could be biodiversity increased, although it could also be monocrops of those high value niche crops. And green urban spaces, which don't mention farmers markets, but they could include farmers markets. And then a real focus on youth, so that you could attribute to, fairness principles. But we also have new directions which are in tension in Malawi. We have the mega farms, which is an initiative where they are trying to increase the amount of large-scale monocrops of maize from medium and large-scale farms. So, for example, the Malawi Defense Force is going to grow 218,000 megatons of maize on 48,400 hectares. That doesn't sound very promising for agroecology. At the same time, Malawi has joined the Agroecology Coalition, and it's the government that has joined. I know the director of the Land Resource Conservation Department, who is really at the forefront of that, and she's very supportive of agroecology. And there is some promotion of different initiatives, both by the government and by research initiatives, including the formation of an agroecology hub and a discussion of a national agroecology policy. As recently as June, I heard directly from the director that this was in the works. So what does that mean? And in this context, it remains to be seen. So another watch this space. So how to support agroecological transformations? Well, I think our work, we feel at least at the farm scale and community scale, this participatory iterative research process is really crucial. And adapting agroecological practices to the local context to address local priorities, which is an agroecological approach anyways, is that adapting piece, addressing inequities and building on local sociocultural values, building networks amongst farmers and beyond, supporting regional market opportunities, and then this big challenge around resisting and challenging dominant narratives and changing the direction of policy and programs, which I don't think we've cracked that nut, but we're trying. So with that, I just want to acknowledge the many people who have worked with me in Malawi and who are doing the work on the ground, and a lot of different funders. So I look forward to our discussion. Thank you. Oh, yes.
Really, because I know it wasn't, I'm sure it wasn't easy to come to think about like transformation because it's such a broad and at the same time deep topic. And so having it the concrete like this, it was very, very helpful for me because it was landed, it was grounded. And you helped me reflect on the time scale, what it means to have immediate needs. Because like transformation, we think about it, it's usually like a long term, even the example of your project. But I wonder how to start it. Does it make sense to start with, of course, what is like the most talent needs? How do you start? How did you start? Was it about gathering and building the trust, seeing what they needed concretely, and then slowly bring in more complex ideas? And
Yeah.
the importance, right, to
Yeah, that's a
think
good
of
question.
the two dimension at the same time, but
Yeah.
it's important now. And
Yeah, and I initially started at the beginning, but then I was like, oh, this is getting too long. So I think starting exactly as you said, by understanding, trying to understand what are the concerns, what are the issues on the ground for, I started with farming households who were severely food insecure, whose kids had been admitted to the hospital for severe malnutrition. So working with local local folks who are really interested and concerned about that issue and trying to understand what are some of the factors that are leading to this situation and then so that's where I started in collaboration with Malawian organizations and people who were interested in that particular issue. So the issue that the strategy at the beginning was very targeted. It was around what are some alternatives to synthetic fertilizer that can both provide maize production, but also provide alternative foods to diversify the diets, while at the same time tackling some of the gender inequalities that was worsening food insecurity and nutrition. So that's kind of where we started, and that generated a lot of interest because farmers were struggling. They couldn't afford fertilizer. They were struggling with malnourished kids. So they were very interested in experimenting with alternatives. We didn't use grand notions of agroecology principles or anything like that. We were much more focused on the sort of immediate concerns. And when they started to have gains around food security, that led to building that relationship of trust and be interested in experimenting further. So I don't know if this is your question, yes. But and I don't know if that's the right way to start or not.
Let's go to someone. Do you mind if we go back and forth?
Sure.
We just have Molly Anderson.
Oh, goody.
Has her hand raised.
Okay.
Molly, if you want to try to speak, and if we can't hear you, I'll put it on my computer.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
I'm hearing echoes. Try again.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm really interested, and let me say, first of all, thank you so much, Rachel, for making the trip over to Vermont and for meeting with students, and I wish I could be up there with you. But I'm really interested in this issue of government subsidies for inputs and the way that that serves as a barrier to agroecology. And my question is whether the farmers themselves are showing any pushback to those subsidies and saying, no, we don't want these. We have other things that we can use instead that are equally effective, or if they are showing any awareness of lack of fertility or decreases in fertility when they're using the synthetic fertilizers over time. So I'm sort of interested in counter narratives, how we fight government subsidies.
all farmers in,
No, go ahead.
I wouldn't lump all farmers into the same category, but certainly the farmers that we've been working with for a while, they do have a counter narrative, multifaceted. One is that the synthetic fertilizer is not good for soils, that it's kind of like a drug, that the soils get degraded and you get stuck in that lock-in. They don't use the word lock-in, but they do talk about it being, it kills the soils. It's bad for the soils, and then you have to use it, but it's not good for the soils. And we have this alternative that also means we don't have to pay for it. And the cost savings is a huge thing for Malawian farmers. It's a huge thing because fertilizer is one of the biggest household expenses. So I think there is an exciting counter narrative. And if I feel like the political moment to kind of push that counter narrative is here, if we could just seize upon it, because the country is grappling with, rampant inflation. It's imported fertilizer. So a place like Malawi, I feel like there is potential for pushing back against the input subsidies. And I do think that's where there is some movement in the government, where they're saying, oh yeah, some organic fertilizer. And yes, we're interested. And a lot of their interest in agroecology is around alternatives to synthetic fertilizer.
I don't know if you want to take both of your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I think, all of us in this room know the world of international development is like a huge beast and a field of study in and of itself. But it seems like, from your last slide, a lot of the interventions were made possible by that funding. So I'm wondering if you could talk more about your role as a researcher within that and how you help shape programs or help give feedback and where the research kind of intersects with program evaluation and improvement and that kind of thing.
Oh, that's a big question. Let's see here. So your question is sort of like, what's my role as a researcher in influencing the direction, right? I think it's important to try to push funders to think about not going with the same old. But that's, of course, easier said than done. And finding like-minded funders who are willing to, take this more complicated and holistic approach to transforming food systems. There are those. I did knock my head against the wall against those who are not that interested, and stopped after a while because I thought, no, maybe I'm wasting my time. Have I had an influence? I don't know. I can't answer that question. You'd have to ask a funder. But I think it's important, to keep doing that. As I've gotten more senior in my role, I have tried to serve on, funding like review boards and that sort of thing, because I think that's important as well. And also, raising awareness within the scientific community in various fora. So I think that there's a modest but important role that one can play in that arena, while recognizing that the vast majority of funding is not in that direction right now, but there is some opening with some funders, and that's where you get this long list. Yeah, thank you.
We got one more. We got another one online. So.
All right. Yeah, you do look like a DJ.
Witness, go ahead. Having some trouble hearing you. Sorry, we can't hear you, Witness. Let's go to someone.
Yeah, maybe
in here
can type it in.
And maybe you can type it in, Witness.
We did have a question.
Thank you so much. That was super enlightening. My question is around your point around locally contextualizing the agroecological principles. So I'm curious whether you or your students found any mainstream principles that didn't work locally or that you sort of rethought as a result of your 30 years of experience working in that context?
You try to repeat the question because I don't know, pick on the back.
Um,
Like you can bring.
yes, so are there any agroecological principles that didn't resonate locally or that we had to kind of adjust? Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think when you're talking about large scale transformation of the food system, sort of at the top level, things like sort of land and natural resource governance, that kind of political change, I think that can seem a little overwhelming for local organizations and folks working in Malawi that I've worked with. And also, they don't necessarily have a window into what's happening in other parts of the world. So their focus often is at the national scale. So when you're starting to talk about, international actors, that can seem very, not related to their own situation. So yeah, I think that's probably what I can think of off the top of my head.
We got another question in the chat that says from Ferris, that says about 7 years ago, investigative reporting revealed that Malawi's seed policy was written almost entirely by agribiz, severely restricting farmers' seed systems. How can we support farmers confront this corporate control over policy that not only inhibits transformation, but changes the system for the worst?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, well, I mean, I've been working with sort of coalitions of Malawian organizations that have been trying to push back against that corporate control. And the seed policy that was enacted, was it 7 years ago, some time ago, it was resisted in Malawi, including, putting on seed fairs and putting together responses, trying to get out to the media. So there was pushback against it. And the government says they're going to have a sort of new policy that is around farmer seed systems. I don't think it's been rolled out yet. So there is mobilizing and I think supporting those coalitions. So there's a Malawi biodiversity network. There's this seed knowledge initiative. So there are local networks that are trying to push back against that and really trying to support those groups. I think is an important. That's the strategy that I've come up with, but more support is needed because these are not well-resourced networks or alliances.
I was first. Yeah. Great presentation. I love the work you do, and I'm excited about the policy analysis. So we can talk about that later, and also the curriculum. But short question. I'm curious first if there were farmers that you've worked with that didn't use fertilizers and that could serve sort of as mentors or people that other farmers would go to. And then also if you guys looked at any change in the yields when the transition happened and what that said.
Very few didn't use fertilizers at all. Most relied somewhat on fertilizer. So what we have seen is some farmers who were willing to try not using fertilizer at all after they had done some work around legum intercrops and compost. But that was seen because the narrative about needing fertilizer is very dominant in Malawi. That was seen as very risky, but there are some farmers who have done that experimentation and can provide that kind of example, like, hey, I don't use fertilizer at all, look at my maize. We have measured maize yields, haven't published it, but yes, we've been able to show an improvement in maize yields with these agroecological practices with that big project that was 6,000 farmers. But yeah, it's on my to-do list, but sorry. Yes.
We got 3 minutes and 17 more questions.
Okay.
So
well, maybe Yeah. Yeah, I feel like you had you with the glasses in the yellow shirt.
Thank you. I guess this is well, first of all, thank you for sharing and responding to the questions. I'm curious about, you mentioned rice as a sort of newer crop that's being cultivated. And I'm curious about the role of rice in the conditions of changing climate. I don't know if Malawi is hit by similar kinds of drought that is affecting Southern Africa in general, and considering the water intensity of paddy, just how much water is needed. Could you talk a bit about that, how it's like part of the broader agroecological?
So there isn't widespread transitioning to rice, but these farmers were trying to experiment with it in an area where they had kind of marshland, where they had wetlands that they were testing it. Malawi has been hit by both drought and flood. They've had both of those impacts. So yeah, transitioning to rice as a primary crop isn't happening. But it was more part of crop diversification to try to have different options available under different conditions.
We have time for one more question from the online.
Okay. I'm going to combine two questions, and it's apt because it's about education. So Marion writes, I was wondering if there are initiatives to bring environmental education on agroecological practices into schools in order to counter misinformation about soil degrading and traditional agriculture methods. I'm going to combine that with Witness's first question, which is similar and addressing bringing this education into university contexts. So I think spanning different types of.
So yes, there's a really neat nonprofit that's done a lot of work around schools in Malawi. I can't remember their acronym, but they're part of this Seeds Knowledge Initiative. They're part of the Agroecology Hub. The organization I work with has also done work so this is secondary schools and primary schools. They've had schools come to the center and learn about agroecological principles. So yes, there is some work around schools. And in terms of the university level, that is part of some of the mobilizing that's happening in Malawi and the broader region. There's a new initiative that's being spearheaded out of South Africa that's trying to build an agroecology network of around education at the university level, and that's kind of just getting off the ground. So there is some movement there on both fronts. Yes, yeah. Okay.
Thanks everybody for coming today. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Sorry to all those folks that had wonderful questions and we didn't quite get to them. If you want to flood Rachel's mailbox, then I'm sure that you could do that and email. We also have some snacks in Leahy 120, I believe.
They will be.
They will be. There will be snacks. We can follow them to Leahy 120 to continue conversation. You can ask Rachel the rest of your questions. And thanks again for coming. Thanks, Rachel, for a wonderful talk.